Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Small Scale Irrigation semi-annual research meeting. On behalf of the project, I want to welcome our presenter, Elizabeth Bryan. She's a senior scientist at the International Food Policy Research Institute based in Washington, D.C. The presentation is based on research conducted with support from USAID in northern Ghana. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. Okay, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to present the research results that we have from the Upper East region in northern Ghana on the impacts of a small-scale irrigation intervention on indicators of women's empowerment. So this research is conducted with my co-author, Dawit Mekonnen, who's a research fellow at IFPRI and EPTD, the Addis Ababa office. And I also want to acknowledge funding support from the CGR program on water, land, and ecosystems, which supported the intervention, and also funding from the Gender, Agriculture, and Assets program, or GAP2, which provided funding for us to test the ProWEA tool, which is the project level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, in the second round of our household survey. So this research is based on a project that took place in the Upper East region of Ghana. The implementing partner that we worked with in this intervention was the International Development Enterprises, or IDE, and they essentially introduced motor pumps to small groups of farmers for dry season cultivation. And the goal of the intervention was to increase productivity of dry season agriculture, to improve food security, improve people's diets, and contribute to women's empowerment by enhancing women's control over agricultural assets, reducing time burden, and increasing income and food security. So in the map here, you can see the dots in brown and red are the communities that we worked in. We did the same survey with sites in blue where the ILSSI interventions also took place, but this research, I'm particularly focusing on the IDE sites where we had an intervention and a randomized design to evaluate the impacts of that intervention. So just to give you an overview of the study area, this is an area I think many of you are familiar with. It has one long rainfall season and then followed by a long dry period. Irrigation is mainly done during the dry season, and the crops that are mostly produced with irrigation are onions mainly. So that was the predominant crop in this area, but farmers also produce okra, tomato, pepper, watermelon, and leafy greens. The main sources of irrigation water vary by communities in our sample. So some households rely on groundwater from dry riverbeds during the dry season. Other farmers tap into water in the local dams. So surface and groundwater are both used. The main predominant source of irrigation method was either buckets or jerry cans, so manual methods at the baseline. And this was reported by 86% of irrigators. Very few households had motor pumps or even manual pumps at the baseline. And irrigators that use any type of pump or gravity irrigate more land. So there is much potential to improve income and productivity from expanding access to motor pumps. So we started this project by thinking through the impact pathways through which the introduction of small-scale irrigation technologies might influence aspects of women's empowerment. First, given that women are often involved in providing labor for irrigation in this area, using the traditional methods like buckets, we hypothesized that motor pumps would reduce their labor burden and the drudgery of irrigation for these women. Because motor pumps were being provided to women and also to men through small groups, we considered that this would potentially increase women's control over productive assets. And we also assumed that motor pumps then, through this increase in productivity, could also lead to greater income from irrigated production and potentially also increase women's role in decision-making on production decisions and over income as income increases. Finally, that we also considered that women may benefit directly through other ways, not necessarily measures of their empowerment, but through improvements in their general food security, diet quality, and nutrition. So how was the intervention carried out? Well, after we conducted our baseline survey, IDE first went to all the communities and facilitated organizations of farmers and groups. So this is a demand-driven intervention where farmers self-selected into the program when IDE first visited the communities. They organized themselves into groups of larger confidence groups, which consisted of around 20 farmers in each group. And then these larger confidence groups were broken down into smaller trust groups of 5 or so farmers. After the groups were formed, we then carried out our baseline survey of all of the farmers that self-selected into groups. Following the baseline survey, we randomly assigned villages into treatment and control villages. The challenge that we had was that we had very uneven demand across the villages in the intervention. So in some villages, there were as few as 20 farmers, and other villages, there were over 200 farmers. So we tried to randomize based on paired groups of villages where there was more or less even demand for the intervention. So if there were 2 villages that had 20 farmers sign up, we selected one of the 2 randomly. So at the end, we had 4 villages that were selected randomly for treatment, and those are highlighted in blue in the table. And you could see the number of farmers from those villages and the number of trust groups that were formed by the intervention. And then within the early treatment villages, so within those 4 villages that were selected for treatment, a random lottery was carried out at the trust group level so that some of the trust groups received preferential credit to purchase a motor pump. So the credit was specifically for the purchase of a motor pump. And this pump was intended to be shared amongst all of the farmers within that trust group. Again, these are like 5 farmers, and each farmer would contribute to repayment of the loan for the pump. So I should note that not all of the farmers that signed up for the groups initially ended up participating in the lottery. So we had people sign up initially, and then they didn't turn out at the lottery time. So we have fewer households in our final treatment group than we would have anticipated based on the initial sign up. But essentially what we create are 2 different control groups. So we have, on the first hand, we have the beneficiary groups and the non-beneficiary groups in the treatment villages. And then we have a set of control villages that didn't receive the intervention at all, where we just have the non-beneficiary trust groups. So we are able to compare the outcomes of the farmers in the beneficiary group with farmers in both the non-beneficiary and non-beneficiary groups in the treatment villages and control villages. And we consider this our first control group. Then, considering that there might be spillover effects from the beneficiaries in the treatment villages to the non-beneficiaries in the same villages, we also look at a second control group, which only includes farmers in the control villages. And then you can see the arrow, the gray arrow in this figure shows that we can also look at the spillover effects by comparing the outcomes of the non-beneficiary groups in the treatment villages with the non-beneficiary groups in the control villages. And this is just to show the initial number of farmers that we had sign up, the initial number of trust groups, and then the number of lottery participants and number of lottery winners that came out of this. So, you know, we might have anticipated more like 400 lottery participants from those 4 communities and closer to 200 lottery winners, but we had fewer numbers in each of these groups. Farmers that didn't show up for the lottery are considered part of the control groups in the treatment villages. So we did have some challenges along the way. One of them was that, you know, this involved multiple components. We were organizing farmers in groups. We're facilitating credit access to encourage them to adopt the technologies. We had uneven demand, as I mentioned, across sites. We also had some challenges in the distribution of pumps. So pumps were first distributed after the dry season had already started, and the farmers, some of them felt that they couldn't repay the loan right away because they weren't able to apply the pumps in that very first dry season. So we then recollected the pumps and redistributed them later. But at the end of the day, not all of the pumps were redistributed to farmers. So we did lose some of our treatment sample there. And so that was one of the challenges that we had. We also had some challenges just with the data collection itself. Sampling was done based on those individuals that signed up for group membership, but we later found that there were multiple members from the same household joining different groups. And so we ended up having a smaller sample of households in our end line when we accounted for that. We also used 2 different versions of the WEA, which I will explain in a little bit. We added some particular questions related to irrigation, so we modified the WEA, which made it a little bit trickier to use when we did our analysis. And so that was another challenge that we had along the way. We use essentially 2 different models to look at the impact of the intervention on indicators of women's empowerment. One is just a first difference estimation where we compare the outcomes of the treated farmers with the 2 different control groups at the end line only. And we did this, number 1, because of all the challenges in the data collection that we had, and number 2, because we did collect pro-WEA data in only our end line round, and we wanted to make use of those data. So we did a first difference estimation there. We also then used the panel data to do a difference in difference estimation to look at the impacts on women's empowerment for the comparing the treatment group to the 2 control groups. And we control for individual characteristics, household characteristics. We also look at the spillover effects, as I mentioned, by looking at the households who didn't win the lottery in treatment villages and comparing them with households in the control villages. And because we did lose households due to attrition and missing variables in our data, and this merging of households that we had to do for some households that had multiple participants. So we do use weights to account for attrition bias in our data set. And I just want to talk a little bit about the WEA in case some of you are not familiar with this indicator. Essentially, in the first round, we used what's called the original WEA, which consists of 10 indicators. And it's grouped by 5 domains of empowerment. In the end line, we used the pro-WEA, which is an index-based measure again, but it has 12 indicators, and these are grouped according to 3 domains of empowerment, which are shown here in the very left column. And these are related to different aspects of agency. So these are intrinsic, instrumental, and collective agency. So at the end line, we use the 10 pro-WEA indicators that we collected for our assessment. And we use an aggregate score for each individual based on these 10 indicators as one of our outcome variables. We also selected a set of outcome variables that related to our research hypotheses about how the program might influence women's empowerment. And these specifically are input into productive decisions, ownership of land and other assets, control over income, and work balance. And these are 4 indicators that were the same across both rounds. Because we had 2 different versions of the WEA in our survey, the ones that are in common through both rounds are the 6 indicators bolded here in this table. And these are basically the indicators that make up the abbreviated Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or AWEA. So for the panel analysis, we use the AWEA as our sort of aggregate measure of women's empowerment at the individual level. And again, we use those same adequacy scores or the sub-indicators as these were the hypothesized outcomes of the intervention. So what do we find? Well, the first difference estimation essentially shows we did find some positive impacts on indicators of women's empowerment using the first control group. So specifically, we found households that were women from households that won the lottery were more likely to achieve adequacy in input into production decisions, as well as adequacy in control over assets. Using the second control group, we again found that input into production decisions was positive and significant, but we've also found some negative different impacts on control over income and work balance compared to the treatment group. We also found some negative spillover effects when we compared the lottery losers with households in the control group in terms of control over assets. So this indicates that perhaps rather than being inadvertently benefited from having some access potentially through spillover effects to households that won a pump, they actually had some potential negative impacts on the control group in the treatment villages. The difference in difference results do also show some potential positive impacts on indicators of women's empowerment. Here we see, using the first control group, positive impacts on adequacy scores of women's control over assets and women's control over income. Using the second group, so just the control villages, we didn't find any significant impacts on women's empowerment. And then when we look at spillover effects, we actually see more negative impacts on households that were in treatment villages that did not win the lottery. So this suggests that there was some potential problems or conflicts that may have arisen as a result of the intervention that actually was not beneficial for these households that did not win the lottery in these communities. We actually prefer the results of this model because this model also shows that there are some differences between the treatment and control groups at the baseline in terms of their empowerment scores. And it also generally shows that there was a change over time where women's empowerment indicators across the board essentially are increasing in all of the groups. And this model controls for those differences at baseline and those changes over time. Some of the other notable research results from the other independent variables are that we found that age was highly significant at influencing women's empowerment, where empowerment generally increases with age. We find that larger land size is associated with lower empowerment scores, especially and probably related to the fact that it increased work burden for women. We found that irrigation status at baseline is associated with higher women's empowerment scores, greater input into production decisions, and asset ownership. So that suggests that there is a relationship there between those women who were already irrigating at the baseline. Perhaps they're irrigating because they're more empowered, or perhaps because they were irrigating, they were more empowered at the start of the intervention. We also found that women are more involved in agricultural decision-making when they have access to groundwater for irrigation compared to surface water. And we also found some significant impacts of climate and idiosyncratic shocks that affect women's empowerment. And idiosyncratic shocks essentially were a death of a family member or an illness of a family member. And these affected women in both positive and negative ways. So we did see greater input into income decisions following climate shocks and greater control over assets following idiosyncratic shocks, suggesting that in some cases women take on a larger role in household decisions and control when there is a shock. I don't know if I have too much time to go into the qualitative results, but I just wanted to...
about 1 minute, so if you could just if there's a way to summarize the qualitative.
Sure, thanks. So we did do qualitative research in all of the villages, interviews with men and women, focus groups, and seasonality calendars. The picture shows that here. We used a conceptual framework that we developed to analyze the relationship between small-scale irrigation and the different aspects of empowerment, as shown here. And we coded the data that we collected in vivo based on our qualitative framework. And essentially what the results show is that the inter-household dynamics and gendered roles are really undergoing tremendous change already in these communities, irrespective of the intervention. So this presents both an opportunity and a burden for women because women are taking on larger economic roles in the household. So while this might be an opportunity for them to have more agency, it also is a burden if they're unable to meet the needs of their household and they're being sort of more responsible for that. We also found that small-scale irrigation may not be the most desirable pathway for women's empowerment, given a lot of the resource constraints that women face in these communities, especially their access to land and water. Also some of the labor constraints and the fact that assets tend to be owned by men. So many of the women reported handing the pumps off to their husband, even if they were the ones in the groups that won access to the pump through the lottery. We found some direct and indirect benefits of small-scale irrigation in terms of food security, better diets, income, social status and respect, and more livelihood choices for women. So one of the things that came out of the qualitative work was that women actually, when the household received the motor pump, they actually got out of irrigation activities and did other livelihood activities. So there was a sort of indirect benefit in terms of their time agency, you could say. And so some of the key messages coming out of the quantitative results, we do see that the intervention had some positive impacts on women's empowerment, such as a potential increase in ag decision-making, asset ownership, and control over income. But the alternative group makes us question this a little bit because we didn't see many positive effects. And we also noted that there were significant negative spillover effects in the treatment villages among households that did not receive the pump. So while there might be some potential here, I think we have to acknowledge that some of these benefits might be indirect. And that there are also some risks to these interventions. So we need to think carefully about implementation of irrigation interventions to make sure that we minimize these risks. Especially, maybe we need to think about randomizing at the village level rather than within a village if this creates conflicts among those households that don't have access to the technology. We might also think about doing some evaluations of other models of disseminating irrigation technology, such as service-based models, and maybe these are a bit more equitable in having farmers gain access to these. So again, I guess I'll stop there since I'm probably out of time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Are there questions for Elizabeth about this study?
I have a question.
Okay, please, Matt, go ahead.
Sure. So, my question is, while this is not directly part of the study, is there evidence that the water from the pumps were also used domestically, and to also hypothesize as to the spillover impacts on household domestic water security? Were you seeing anything there?
Yeah, that's not something we explicitly explored in this paper. I think we do have the data to be able to look at that. I can go back and check the questionnaire, but I think we have some questions about the sources of water and whether these were also used for irrigation. It might actually be that we asked those when we asked about domestic water sources and uses rather than about the irrigation water. My sense is that they're maybe different because I think most households used specific pumps for domestic water sources that were, located in the villages, whereas they're using the motor pumps, in the dry riverbed and hand dug wells or at the dams to extract water and then apply them to their field. So my sense is that these are different, but it's not something that we've completely looked at yet.
Got it. Thank you.
One of the key messages on also conclusion is that small-scale irrigation may not a pathway to empower women. I think it should be somehow more specific in what context is not the pathway, because what we see in the Upper East region of Ghana, the small-scale irrigation is really livelihood kind of strategy for women farmers, which help them to do both improving the household nutrition situation and also income to fit into the household expenditures and need, especially for women who manage to grow leafy vegetable and supply to the local and also domestic market, even to Accra or Tamales or Kumasi market. So I think it needs a little bit more kind of pack up with in what context that could not be the pathway. Yeah,
no, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of nuance here. So we certainly, through the qualitative work, the women certainly said, this is definitely benefiting us. It's benefiting our households. And I think the fact that if women were irrigating at baseline, they tended to have higher empowerment scores suggests that irrigation is empowering for women. And then, we did have some positive results on the indicators of women's empowerment from the intervention. I'm just suggesting that in some cases that those empowerment effects may be indirect, where, because we actually heard many women say in the qualitative research, thank God the pumps have come because now I don't have to do irrigation anymore. I can do other things. So we're able to make other livelihood choices in some cases, which is still a benefit of the intervention, but not directly through irrigation. At the same time, women also talked about having access to, diverse diets, more food security from irrigation. So there are a lot of direct and indirect benefits for women for sure, but I think maybe not in all cases. So women that have trouble accessing land or water for irrigation, maybe are more constrained and might prefer to pursue other livelihood opportunities, for example. So it's really, there's a lot of nuance there. And I think it is certainly one pathway among many. That's the way I would kind of put it, depending on the circumstances for individual women.
Racine, are you still on? Are you able to go ahead and ask your question or make your comment?
Yes, sure. So thank you, Elizabeth, for your nice presentation. I was just wondering whether it will not be more interesting to add also village fix effects, because my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, was that your respondents are in different villages, and some of your control group are in the same villages with the treatment group. And again, since maybe the assignment is not necessarily at the village level, but village are not selected randomly, you may want to capture this in your regression.
Yeah, we do actually include village level controls. I should have put that in the slide, but we do actually have that in the model.
Fitsum also has a question. Fitsum, sorry, I think I don't know. Anyway, I'll go ahead and read the question that Fitsum had, which is any explanation or observations around the difference in empowerment between surface water and groundwater?
Yeah, that was a bit surprising to me too. In communities where they had access to a dam, we actually found more households were irrigating. I would think that would be an easier pathway for women if there's more water available for irrigation. But perhaps because groundwater is, it's sort of a surprising and counterintuitive result for me. But perhaps groundwater is more easily managed than the surface water. I know some of the households reported having to travel long distances to access plots near surface water versus groundwater. Maybe those are located closer to the home, and so women have easier access to that. So that's something that we can certainly try to dig into a little bit more.
And we'll take a last question from Melkamu.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. Mine was a small question to ask you whether you have observed a kind of a role of a change in the role of men due to an increase in income because of the pump introduction.
Yeah, actually, the results tend to suggest the opposite is happening. Whether it's because women are controlling the income from irrigated production directly, or whether it's because the household just has more income, so women have more control over how it's used. The difference results tended to suggest that women are actually have more control over income as a result of having access to the pump. So I would guess that that's more the latter, that as household incomes increase, women are also more involved in decision-making about expenditure decisions.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you for all the great questions.